Guadalcanal, 1942. A Marine fires at a Japanese sniper high in a palm tree. The enemy jerks, goes still, but he doesn't fall. He just hangs there, swaying slightly with the trunk. The Marine whispers to his buddy, "Is he dead or is he waiting for me to walk out?" That question kept thousands of young Americans awake at night, until they stopped looking for men and started looking for trees that didn't dance with the wind. The South Pacific campaigns of World War II are remembered for their brutal island-hopping assaults, for flamethrowers clearing cave systems, for desperate banzai charges across blood-soaked beaches. But there was another war happening in those campaigns, one fought in the vertical dimension of the jungle canopy, where the slightest movement could mean the difference between living and dying. This is the story of how young American Marines cracked a nearly perfect camouflage technique, using nothing but observation, and how nature itself became the ultimate lie detector. When the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in August 1942, they carried with them the tactical doctrines developed for European-style warfare. They expected to fight an enemy that held ground, that defended positions, that could be overwhelmed with superior firepower and maneuver. What they found instead was an enemy that had spent years perfecting the art of becoming invisible in the jungle environment. The Japanese had studied British colonial warfare tactics in Southeast Asia, had learned from their own campaigns in China and Manchuria, and had developed a philosophy of combat that prioritized patience, concealment, and psychological warfare over raw firepower. The coconut palm, which dominated the landscape of Pacific Islands from the Solomons to Palau, became the perfect weapon in this new kind of war. These trees grew 60 to 80 feet tall, with thick trunks that could support human weight, and crowns of fronds that provided natural concealment. More importantly, they were everywhere, lining beaches, clustering in groves inland, standing sentinel over every approach and avenue of advance. To the Japanese tactical planners, every palm tree was a potential sniper position, a watchtower that required no construction and blended perfectly into the environment. But the Japanese didn't just climb these trees and shoot from them. That would have been too simple, too easy to counter once the Americans understood the threat. Instead, they developed a technique that was as ingenious as it was terrifying. They called their elite snipers tree demons, or sometimes spider snipers, men who could ascend to the crown of a palm tree under cover of darkness, tie themselves securely to the trunk, and then spend days in position without moving, waiting for the perfect shot. The preparation for a tree sniper position began long before the shooter climbed into position. Intelligence officers would identify key terrain, crossroads, water sources, likely approaches for American patrols, areas where Marines would have to expose themselves. Then engineers would select specific trees, often choosing those that offered clear sight lines but were surrounded by similar-looking palms that would make pinpointing the shooter's location nearly impossible. In some cases, they would even climb multiple trees in an area and prepare them all, leaving the final choice of which to occupy to the sniper himself. The snipers selected for this duty were among the best marksmen in the Imperial Japanese Army, but marksmanship was only part of the qualification. They needed the physical endurance to climb 60 feet with rifle and equipment, the patience to remain absolutely motionless for hours or even days, the mental discipline to control their breathing and heart rate while hanging in a precarious position, and the tactical intelligence to choose when to shoot and when to remain hidden. Most importantly, they needed to master the art of camouflage at a level that went far beyond simply wearing the right colors. The technique itself was brutally simple, but devastatingly effective. The sniper would climb to a position near the crown of the palm, typically 40 to 60 feet above the ground. Using rope or leather straps, he would tie himself to the trunk in multiple places, creating a secure harness that would hold him, even if he was hit or killed. This was the critical innovation that would later create so much psychological trauma for the Marines. The sniper didn't need to maintain his position through muscle strength. The ropes did that for him, leaving him free to focus entirely on concealment and shooting. Once secured, the real art began. The sniper would carefully weave dead palm fronds into his clothing and equipment, creating a three-dimensional camouflage that broke up his human outline. But they didn't just stick fronds randomly onto themselves. That would create an unnatural thickness, a bulge that would stand out to a trained eye. Instead, they studied how palm fronds naturally hung and overlapped in the crown, matching those patterns in their camouflage. They would tie fronds so they hung downward naturally, creating the illusion of simply being part of the tree's foliage. Some would even cut small slits in the fronds to allow for observation and shooting while maintaining the natural appearance. The netting was another crucial element. Japanese snipers would drape camouflage nets over themselves and their rifles, then carefully insert pieces of vegetation into the netting. But again, this wasn't random. They studied the specific type of palm, the way its fronds cast shadows, the typical density of vegetation at various heights, and they matched those characteristics precisely. A sniper in a coconut palm would use different vegetation patterns than one in a sago palm or a betel nut palm. They understood that effective camouflage wasn't about becoming a bush. It was about becoming a specific, natural-looking part of a specific tree. The psychological impact of these sniper spiders was immediate and devastating. Marines who had fought bravely against visible enemies, who had charged machine gun positions and held ground under artillery bombardment, found themselves paralyzed by an enemy they couldn't see. The first encounters followed a predictable pattern. A patrol would be moving through an area that had been declared secure, taking a break near a grove of palms, when suddenly one man would drop, killed by a shot that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The patrol would immediately take cover and begin scanning for the shooter, but they were looking at ground level, checking buildings, fallen logs, anything that could conceal a prone shooter. Sometimes they would spot muzzle flash or movement in a tree and return fire. And this is where the true genius of the technique revealed itself. Even when Marines hit their target, even when they knew they had placed rounds into the sniper's body, the enemy wouldn't fall. He would jerk with the impact, might even cry out, but then he would just hang there, swaying slightly with the tree's movement in the breeze. The ropes that had allowed him to maintain his position in life now held his corpse in place in death. This created an impossible tactical problem. Marines couldn't know if the sniper was actually dead or merely playing dead, waiting for them to expose themselves. They couldn't advance past the area without neutralizing the threat, but they also couldn't afford to waste ammunition shooting at every tree or spend hours suppressing a position that might already be clear. Some units developed the tactic of shooting the same sniper position multiple times over several minutes, hoping that if the sniper was alive, he would eventually react or return fire. But this gave away the patrol's position and sometimes attracted fire from other concealed positions. The psychological toll was immense. Marines began to dread palm groves the way infantry in World War I dreaded no man's land. Sleep became difficult because any moment could bring a shot from above. Patrols moved slowly, constantly scanning upward, exhausting themselves with vigilance. Some men developed what would later be recognized as symptoms of combat fatigue, specifically related to the sniper threat, experiencing nightmares about being watched from above or becoming convinced that every tree held an enemy. The frustration ran through every level of command. Platoon sergeants watched their men become paranoid and jumpy. Company commanders saw their patrol effectiveness degraded as units became fixated on clearing trees rather than accomplishing mission objectives. Battalion staff received casualty reports that showed a disturbing pattern. Men killed by single, well-aimed shots, often while in supposedly secure areas, with no enemy bodies recovered, and no clear indication of where the fire had originated. Conventional counter-sniper tactics weren't working. In European or open-terrain warfare, counter-snipers could use techniques like triangulating muzzle reports, watching for muzzle flash, or using terrain analysis to identify likely hide positions. But in the dense jungle environment with its confusing acoustics and multiple layers of vegetation, these techniques failed. The sound of a shot seemed to come from everywhere. Muzzle flash was invisible in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, and there were simply too many potential hide positions to systematically check every tree. Some units tried aggressive tactics like shooting into every palm tree before moving through an area, but this was wildly impractical. A typical coconut grove might contain hundreds of trees. Even with automatic weapons, the amount of ammunition required was staggering, and it still didn't guarantee results. The thick crown of a palm tree could absorb dozens of rounds without hitting a human-sized target near the trunk. Other units requested artillery or mortar fire on suspected sniper trees, but this was expensive, slow, and often counterproductive, as the explosions would alert other Japanese positions to American movements. Then gradually, almost organically, the solution began to emerge from the youngest and least experienced Marines, the privates and lance corporals who had been in the Pacific Theater for only a few months. It started with a handful of individual observations, comments made almost casually during debriefings or in conversations between patrols. That tree looked wrong somehow. Something was off about the top of that palm. It didn't move right. These comments were initially dismissed by veteran sergeants and officers as the paranoid observations of scared young men seeing threats everywhere. But the observations kept coming, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge. One of the first documented instances came from a Marine named Private First Class, who had grown up on a farm in Iowa. During a patrol sweep near the Matanikau River on Guadalcanal, he insisted to his squad leader that a particular palm tree looked sick and convinced the squad to give it a wide berth. 2 days later, another unit engaged a sniper in that exact tree. The private couldn't articulate exactly what had tipped him off, just that something about the crown of the tree hadn't looked natural. His squad leader, a corporal who had been in the Pacific since the landing, began paying attention to what the farm kid was saying. Another early observer was a Marine from rural Oregon who had worked as a logger before the war. He noticed that when wind moved through a palm grove, the trees would sway in a particular rhythm, their fronds creating a wave-like pattern as the wind passed through. But occasionally, one tree would be out of sync, its crown moving stiffly or not at all while the surrounding palms danced in the breeze. He mentioned this to his fire team, and they began watching for the same phenomenon. Within a week, they had identified and neutralized 3 sniper positions, all in trees that had shown that telltale rigidity. A third critical observation came from a Marine who had grown up hunting in the swamps of Louisiana. He was used to scanning tree lines for game, looking for the subtle disruptions in natural patterns that betrayed the presence of deer or wild pigs. He began applying the same visual hunting techniques to palm groves, looking not for human shapes, but for anomalies in the vegetation itself. He noticed that sniper trees often had crowns that were denser at the top than surrounding trees, creating a dark spot or bulge that blocked more light than natural foliage would. More importantly, this dense spot would cast a static shadow pattern, while natural fronds created moving, dappled shadows as they swayed. These individual observations might have remained isolated tactical tricks used by a few lucky units, but the Marine Corps had a culture of aggressive after-action reporting and lateral information sharing, especially at the small unit level. Sergeants talked to other sergeants. Officers compared notes during battalion meetings. And most importantly, the observations were tested and proven in combat. When units deliberately sought out trees with these unnatural characteristics and engaged them, they consistently found snipers. The technique worked, and word spread rapidly. Within months, what had started as individual observations had codified into a systematic approach that was being taught to new replacements before they ever went on patrol. The teaching focused on understanding natural patterns first, and then recognizing deviations from those patterns. Marines were taught to observe a palm grove as a whole system, rather than looking at individual trees. They learned to notice when one element of that system was behaving differently from the others. The key insight was about movement and light. Natural palm fronds are flexible and relatively light for their size. When wind moves through them, they respond immediately and fluidly, creating a flowing organic motion. They also hang in a way that allows light to filter through at various angles, creating complex patterns of light and shadow that shift constantly throughout the day. Dead palm fronds, however, especially when tied or woven into fabric and equipment, behave completely differently. They're stiffer, heavier, and don't respond to light wind. They create static dark patches where they block light completely, rather than filtering it. The deformed coconut method became the shorthand way of teaching the technique. Instructors would tell new Marines to scan the crowns of palm trees, looking for shapes that resembled a coconut but were in the wrong place or too large. The human head and torso, even when camouflaged, creates a mass that's roughly spherical or oval, about the size and shape of a large coconut. But coconuts grow in clusters beneath the fronds, not up in the crown itself. So a coconut-sized mass visible in the crown of a palm was immediately suspect. Similarly, an area of the crown that was too dense, that looked swollen or bulging compared to surrounding trees, likely concealed a human body. Marines learned to use their peripheral vision, which is more sensitive to movement than direct vision. They would scan across a tree line without focusing on any individual tree, allowing their peripheral vision to detect trees that weren't moving in sync with their neighbors. They learned to watch palm groves during wind gusts, when the contrast between natural movement and artificial rigidity was most pronounced. They learned to check the same grove at different times of day, because changing sun angles would reveal static shadow patterns that natural vegetation wouldn't create. The tactical application of this knowledge became known as reconnaissance by fire, though it was a more sophisticated version of that technique than the name suggests. Rather than simply shooting randomly into suspicious areas, Marines would systematically scan a palm grove from a distance, identify trees that showed the telltale signs of sniper presence, mark those specific trees, and then engage them with concentrated fire. The technique had several steps, each designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing ammunition expenditure and risk. First, a patrol approaching an area with palm trees would halt at a safe distance, typically 200 to 300 yards out, beyond effective rifle range. Using binoculars if available or simply careful observation if not, they would spend several minutes watching the tree line. They were looking for several specific indicators: trees with crowns that were denser or darker than surrounding trees, trees that didn't move properly in the wind, trees with unusual silhouettes against the sky, and especially any trees where they could detect geometric shapes or straight lines, which don't occur naturally in vegetation. Second, once suspicious trees were identified, the patrol would mark them by reference to nearby landmarks, or by having multiple observers confirm they were all looking at the same tree. This step was crucial, because once shooting started, muzzle smoke and kicked-up debris would make it difficult to track which trees had been engaged. Third, the patrol would assign specific trees to specific shooters or fire teams, rather than everyone shooting at everything. This fire discipline ensured that each suspicious tree received concentrated fire and allowed the unit to track which positions had been adequately suppressed. The preferred technique was to have automatic weapons, typically Browning automatic rifles or light machine guns, deliver sustained bursts into the crown of each marked tree. Fourth, and this was critical, Marines would watch for secondary indicators while firing. If a sniper was present and alive, the sustained fire would often provoke a reaction: return fire, movement as the sniper tried to acquire the shooters, equipment falling from the tree, or the distinctive sound of rounds hitting flesh and bone rather than just wood and leaves. If a sniper was present but already dead, the firing would sometimes cut the ropes holding him, causing the body to fall. Either outcome confirmed the tree was compromised. Fifth, even after apparently neutralizing a tree, patrols would approach cautiously, watching for any sign of movement. The paranoia about hanging dead snipers meant that Marines would often fire additional bursts into a tree as they got closer, sometimes even after a body had fallen, just to be absolutely certain the threat was eliminated. This systematic approach transformed the tactical situation in the Pacific Theater. The invisible threat that had paralyzed patrols and created debilitating psychological stress became a manageable problem with clear identification criteria and established response procedures. More importantly, the psychological advantage shifted. Japanese snipers who had operated with near impunity now found themselves being identified and engaged before they could fire a shot. The trees that had been their perfect concealment became death traps once Marines learned to read them correctly. The Japanese military attempted several adaptations to counter the new American tactics. Some snipers abandoned the tied-in technique, instead holding position through muscular strength and climbing spikes, allowing them to descend quickly if identified. But this meant they couldn't maintain position for extended periods and were far more likely to be spotted during movement. Other snipers tried to improve their camouflage by using only fresh green fronds that might move more naturally in the wind, but these wilted quickly in the tropical heat, creating brown patches that were even more visible than the original dead frond camouflage. Some Japanese units moved away from tree sniping entirely, instead using ground-level spider holes or cave positions. These had their own advantages, particularly in rocky terrain where caves were plentiful, but they lacked the commanding view and psychological impact of the tree positions. The most successful adaptation was actually a return to more mobile sniper tactics, with shooters taking 1 or 2 shots and then immediately relocating, but this required far more training and discipline than the static tree positions. The broader impact of the tree reading technique extended beyond just counter-sniper operations. It represented a fundamental shift in how Marines approached jungle warfare. They began to understand that the jungle itself was the tactical problem, not just the enemy within it. This led to the development of other pattern recognition techniques for identifying booby traps, camouflaged bunkers, and hidden trails. The insight that nature has consistent patterns and deviations from those patterns reveal human presence became a cornerstone of small unit tactics in every subsequent jungle campaign. The statistical impact, while difficult to measure precisely given the spotty record-keeping of combat conditions, was significant. Units that adopted the tree-reading techniques reported substantial reductions in sniper casualties. On Palaleu in September 1944, 1st Marine Division units that had carried the technique forward from Guadalcanal experienced roughly 1/3 the sniper casualties of units in their first Pacific deployment. While multiple factors contributed to this difference, including greater overall experience and improved doctrine, the ability to identify and neutralize tree snipers before they could engage was repeatedly cited in after-action reports as a critical capability. Beyond the numbers, the psychological impact was equally important. Marines who had felt helpless against an invisible enemy now had agency. They had a technique they could learn, practice, and apply successfully. The constant background anxiety of moving through palm groves diminished. Sleep became easier when Marines felt they could identify and clear threats before establishing perimeter positions. Combat effectiveness increased as patrols could focus on their primary objectives rather than being consumed by counter-sniper paranoia. The story of the palm tree snipers and the Marines who learned to read them offers several enduring lessons about warfare, observation, and adaptation. First, it demonstrates that sophisticated technology and overwhelming firepower aren't always the solution to tactical problems. The Marines who cracked the sniper code didn't do it with better weapons or more ammunition. They did it with careful observation and pattern recognition, skills that any individual could develop regardless of equipment. Second, it highlights the importance of understanding the environment as deeply as understanding the enemy. The Japanese snipers were masterful tacticians who had developed a nearly perfect technique. What defeated them wasn't better tactics, but better understanding of the natural environment they were trying to exploit. The Marines who figured out the tree-reading technique weren't thinking about fighting snipers. They were thinking about how trees naturally behave and noticing when that behavior was disrupted. Third, the story illustrates that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The veteran sergeants and experienced officers weren't the ones who figured out the pattern. It was the farm kids, the hunters, the loggers, young men with direct experience of natural environments who saw what the military professionals missed. This speaks to the importance of listening to observations from all levels of an organization and not dismissing insights simply because they come from inexperienced sources. Fourth, it shows the power of systematic observation over reactive response. The initial American reaction to tree snipers was to shoot more, bring more firepower, request more support. What actually worked was slowing down, observing carefully, identifying specific indicators, and then applying force precisely rather than overwhelmingly. This principle applies far beyond jungle warfare. The legacy of these lessons extended into later conflicts. During the Vietnam War, American forces that had institutional memory from the Pacific campaigns applied similar pattern recognition techniques to identify booby traps, punji stakes, and camouflaged tunnel entrances. The principle of looking for disruptions in natural patterns rather than looking for specific threats became part of standard small unit training. Modern military forces continue to teach these observational skills, now often formalized as combat tracking or tactical site exploitation, but the underlying principle remains the same. Nature has patterns, and humans disrupt those patterns in detectable ways. The technique also found applications far beyond military contexts. Wildlife biologists use similar pattern recognition methods to identify animal signs in dense vegetation. Search and rescue teams train to spot disruptions in natural environments that might indicate human presence. Even urban surveillance and counter-surveillance training employs the same basic principle, teaching operators to identify elements of an environment that don't fit natural patterns. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the palm tree snipers serves as a reminder that in any competitive or conflict situation, the side that understands the environment more deeply has a fundamental advantage. The Japanese snipers understood palm trees well enough to hide in them effectively, but the Marines who defeated them understood palm trees well enough to recognize when something was hiding in them. That deeper level of environmental awareness, that ability to read nature's baseline and spot deviations from it, proved more valuable than any amount of firepower or technological advantage. In the end, looking back at that young Marine on Guadalcanal in 1942, staring up at a palm tree with a hanging dead sniper, and wondering if the enemy was really dead or just waiting, we can see the entire war in miniature. The terror, the uncertainty, the helplessness against an enemy who had mastered his environment. But we can also see the solution that emerged, not through better weapons or more aggression, but through observation, patience, and understanding. The palm trees themselves became the lie detectors, revealing the snipers who tried to become part of them, because nature has a rhythm and language of its own, and anything that doesn't speak that language stands out to those who know how to listen. The snipers had perfected the art of hiding in the trees, but they couldn't make the trees themselves lie. The wind still blew. The light still filtered through natural fronds differently than through dead ones. The organic dance of a living tree still differed from the rigid stillness of one concealing a human. And young Americans, many of whom had grown up in rural areas where reading nature was as natural as breathing, learned to see those differences. They stopped looking for men and started looking for trees that didn't belong in the forest they were pretending to be part of. That shift in perspective, from hunting an enemy to reading an environment, marked a turning point not just in the Pacific Campaign, but in the entire American approach to jungle warfare. It was a lesson bought with blood and fear, taught by experience and desperation, and perfected through the kind of lateral learning that happens when survival depends on sharing information rather than hoarding it. And it worked because at its core was a simple truth. You can camouflage a man to look like a tree, but you can't make him move like one, and you can't make the tree move naturally when he's in it. If you found this story fascinating, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more untold military history. Drop a like if you learned something new today, and leave a comment telling us, what other hidden tactics from history should we cover next? Your support keeps these stories alive.